This is Technically Legal, a podcast about legal technology, innovation in the legal industry, and the impact tech is having on the law. I'm Chad Main, the founder of legal services company Percipient, and on today's show, I'm in conversation with April Miller Boise. We're talking about her perspectives running an Am Law 200 firm and then becoming CLO of one of the world's major technology players. When you look at the path of a top-tier legal career, there's the usual playbook, right? You go to a top law school, you land at a top law firm, you put in your 10,000 plus billable hours, you make partner, and if you reach the pinnacle of the law firm world, you become managing partner of an Am Law 200 firm. You figure at that point, you basically made it to the top of the mountain. So if you're there, why would anyone at the peak of their career at a major law firm decide to pack up and take a massive leap into the unknown? Well, for today's guest, April Miller Boise, the answer came down to a simple question she'd been asking herself ever since her early days walking assembly plant floors in Detroit. What are we actually making here? In her career, April spent some years doing legal on Wall Street and, as noted, ended up in big law management. But she just didn't want to advise businesses from the outside. She wanted to be in the room where the decisions were being made. So she took that jump and she went in-house. First, she led a legal department through a massive carve-out at a Goodyear spinoff. Then she navigated global power management at Eaton. And eventually she landed right in the middle of one of the biggest tech transformations in our history, when she ascended the ranks and became Chief Legal Officer at Intel. I've had a lot of cool conversations doing this podcast, and here's another one today. Well, I think it's so cool is because April's been on both sides of the table at the very highest levels. She's been managing partner of a huge law firm and CLO of a major tech company. So as she steps back today and reflects on all the positions she's held in her career, she has some thoughts about the pain points in the profession. Specifically, the gap between what corporate legal departments need and what traditional law firms are built to deliver. That gap seems to be widening, and fast, especially in the AI age. On today's show, April and I talk about a bunch of stuff, including her journey from Detroit manufacturing plants to Silicon Valley boardrooms. We talk about why the billable hour model is clashing with the speed of AI, and we'll close out our conversation talking about what young lawyers actually need to do if they want to survive in an industry that probably ain't going to look the same in 10 years.
So I was in private practice for quite a long time, compared to many people who go in-house. And then, yes, I went in-house after I was a partner and managing partner of an office and then on an executive committee. So went right into being a CLO.
So that's pretty interesting. Make sure I got this right. You come out of UFC law. You go into private practice for several years. You go to Cleary. Then you go to Thompson Hine. You become managing partner. But what's interesting is then you make the jump to in-house. So tell me, what's your progression in private practice, and why do you make the jump once you're at the highest level at a law firm? You really can't get much higher, you know?
So I studied business undergrad, which I think is really important. I went to the University of Michigan, got to get that in there, go blue. I studied business, and I think, I grew up in Detroit in and around the automotive industry. And I really think because of studying business and being around the automotive industry, and I interned several years in the automotive industry, I was always really interested in the business and getting to know the business. I loved when I interned at Saturn and at General Motors and then later worked at Ford. I did a lot of plant visits. And so we really got to see what are the products that we're making and what's the innovation behind them. And so when I started practicing law, I was like, what are we making? We're pushing paper around, we have great ideas, and we're really helping our clients. But it was really a different kind of job, if you will. And so I always wanted to be closer to the business. And so I was an M&A lawyer. I practiced on Wall Street. As you said, I practiced at Cleary. And I really loved mergers and acquisitions and private equity because particularly with mergers and acquisitions, we were often, Wall Street counsel, we were hired as the hired gun to get a deal done. And so you were working with a new client, maybe in a new industry each time. And so you were really doing a deep dive, particularly as a junior lawyer, getting up to speed, learning their business, doing due diligence, trying to understand who the target was, why they wanted to acquire them, what was in it for the company and what was in it for the target company and, their stakeholders, their employees, et cetera. And so I was constantly doing deep dives on business and ultimately decided that I really liked being on the business side and wanted to be closer to the business side. I really loved being in law firm leadership. As you said, I was the managing partner of the Thompson Hine Cleveland office. And that really gave me a sense of running a business and really thinking about the P&L part of it, not just the, providing legal services. But I wasn't sure, I was pretty senior to your point, and I wasn't sure I wanted to go in-house because it was taking a big risk from, having partners that you knew and you practiced with for a long time, having a successful practice, but ultimately got recruited to a company that had been a client, a spinoff from a client. And so it was relatively low risk because I knew the client, I knew some of the executives there, and it was local. And so I always thought, hey, if this doesn't work, I can go back to practicing law. But ultimately, got there and loved it because I really loved, being at the table where the decisions were being made, for example, on doing a deal. Like, why are we doing this deal? Should we do this deal? Before you made the decision to do the deal, then you called in the outside lawyers. I was really at the table much earlier on, and that's really what I wanted.
The first job you had in-house was a spinoff of Goodyear, correct?
That's exactly right. So Goodyear had been a big client of mine, and this was a corporate carve out, if you will. They were very big at the time, people getting back to their core. And so we helped them spin off this business. And then ultimately later, a couple of years later, it was private equity backed and they wanted new leadership. I ended up going to that company.
So you ultimately ascend to the highest, you become CLO at the highest levels in-house too, but you're the highest levels of law firm life too. You're both leaders of your respective legal departments, for lack of a better word. What's the biggest difference between being a managing partner at a law firm versus the chief legal officer at an in-house legal department?
So, of course, I mean, the work in some ways is very similar, but to your point, it is very different. When you're at a law firm and you are, particularly if you're in management, you really are driving a P&L. Like you run the business, you own the business, and you're really thinking about how do I continue to grow, specifically the legal services that we're selling to our clients. When you're an in-house lawyer, even when you're the CLO, you're not necessarily driving P&L. Like what you do is not the P&L. You're not in the business of selling legal services. What you're really doing is you need to be a very effective part of an important senior leadership team. So the senior leadership team together with the board, you guys are setting the strategy and then driving the strategy for the entire, in my case, global enterprise. But the part I'm doing, there's a whole leadership team and each person has their role on the leadership team. So the part I'm doing is, of course, very focused on strategy and growth, but the kind of functions that I've run also very focused on risk, compliance, and other legal issues. And so I think you're, again, just much closer to the business and sitting around the table with the leadership team, really developing that strategy and refining that strategy, and then going out and helping the global team understand that strategy and how their work that they're doing every day should be aligned with that strategy and driving that strategy so that you can win in the market.
Did you find there was more flexibility being the managing partner of a law firm vis-a-vis being the CLO? Because, you're just one part of a big organization, but you're kind of the head honcho at the law firm.
You're practicing law and you're providing legal services, but it is a really different role. In one place, you're, driving the P&L of a firm and you're making decisions on behalf of that firm and you're selling legal services. Whereas at a company, the provision of legal services and other business advice is a really important part of what my corporate function is doing. But ultimately, we are a really important part of helping the broader company and the broader leadership team execute and deliver on that strategy and mitigate or balance the risks that come along with that. They're just very, very, very different roles. And I think sometimes, I think what we've seen converge, especially now, with everything that we're seeing with artificial intelligence and all the technology in the legal industry, what we're seeing happen is that I think the pace of legal services has changed quite a bit. And I think the pace of what happens in-house is very different than the pace perhaps that law firms move at. And I think sometimes in-house lawyers, CLOs in particular, get a little bit frustrated with legal counsel outside because we don't always have the luxury of, kind of waiting for a lot of research to be done, for people to really boil the ocean, if you will, and maybe do A+ research on an issue that's important, but maybe doesn't deserve necessarily boil the ocean attention. It needs to be based on risk and it needs to be based on the value that we're attributing to that issue. And so I think internal counsel is moving much faster than external counsel, much more nimble. We need answers right now. We're not going to wait for the perfect. We need to decide, hey, this is good enough for this particular issue. This is not a bet the company issue. And so we need to be quick in providing the best legal advice and counsel that we can to the business based on, with imperfect facts, right? We never have perfect information. And I think sometimes outside counsel wants to get to that perfect information.
I think it was a LinkedIn post or an article you wrote that I saw on LinkedIn, but you said, and to your point here, you said, I see a widening gap between what corporate legal departments need and expect from their outside counsel. And here's the part I want to focus on, and what most law firms are built to deliver. You kind of intimated they're built a little differently in in-house departments. How does that change? If they got to catch up or we got problems now, like, how do you want them to change?
Well, I think one of the things that I've seen with the law firm model, and this has been developing for a while, it just didn't happen overnight, but law firms are, outside counsel wants to pay for expertise. And so what's happening is that law firms are training lawyers to be very narrowly focused in a particular area of law so that they can be experts in that area. So, when you're a law firm partner, and this was true of me as well, maybe a little bit different as a corporate lawyer and a business lawyer, but you're 10 miles deep in your area of expertise. And I think some law firms are starting to, in some ways, almost pigeonhole lawyers and associates. So, like, we want you to focus only in this area because we want somebody to be an expert at this and we want to be able to sell that expertise. But what happens is they don't have a broad aperture. And so they're not really good often at seeing the bigger picture or understanding the broader business and legal implications because they're so narrowly focused in their area of expertise, which is wonderful when that's what you need. But when you need a broader perspective, sometimes your lawyers at the law firms just aren't equipped to do that. I think AI is changing everything, right? I think some law firms are really leaning into AI and trying to understand how best to use it. What's their new P&L model? What's the value that they can deliver using these artificial intelligence tools? How do they train their associates, et cetera? And then I think other law firms are saying, well, this doesn't really impact us because we're really smart lawyers and, the machines can never replace us. And I think that's a really big mistake. So I think we're going to continue to see this evolution in the industry. And I think there's going to be a divergence, if you will, in law firms in terms of those who really lean in to the technology and those who decide we don't need it.
Going back to your background, so you're at the Goodyear spinoff, which is Vance, right? Am I saying that right?
Correct. Advanced technology.
And then you go to Eaton, which is also manufacturing, correct?
Yes, I spent a lot of time in manufacturing. Again, like I always go back to those Detroit roots because I grew up close to the automotive industry and, spent a lot of time kind of walking manufacturing sites and walking the plant floor. That innovation and the technology in the manufacturing sites, I was always really interested in that. And again, like making things and being a maker of things. And so yes, was in manufacturing, I would say advanced manufacturing and innovation. And, Eaton is an intelligent power management company. So a lot of their work is focused on helping companies manage their power, whether that's electrical vehicles or aerospace. And a big part of what they did is systems for the electrical grid, which of course is even more and more important now because of all the data center infrastructure challenges that we see as, more and more artificial intelligence is adopted and consumes more power. Therefore, we need to build more power and more infrastructure.
How do you get to Intel? Obviously, Intel makes chips, there's manufacturing aspect, but I think most people think of it's more tech. Like, how do you end up there from where you were?
I would say it was really the background in innovation and manufacturing. So, at the end of the day, Intel is absolutely a tech company, but also a manufacturer. And so what they do is Intel makes chips. And there was a time where Intel was really evaluating whether, most of the companies, all their competitors that made leading edge logic chips no longer manufacture those chips. They all decided not to do that anymore and instead to only design the chips and sell the chips, but not to also design and manufacture or fab them. TSMC, that is obviously a very well-known and highly regarded company, but is Taiwanese, is a foundry, and they make leading node logic chips for lots and lots and lots of chip companies. But many of the chip companies that we think about, NVIDIA, AMD, et cetera, they do not make their own chips. So Intel was at a crossroads and was considering, should we be, a fabless company, which is how people refer to it, i.e., we design chips and we do a lot of research, but we don't make our own chips. We fab that out to somebody else like TSMC. Ultimately, they decided that for them, it was important to be both, to have a product side of the business where they design chips and then a manufacturing side of the business where they make chips for themselves. And they decided to be a foundry as well to make chips for third parties. And that's because of just the sheer capital intensity of being a leading node logic chip manufacturer. They needed to be able to scale that and to share those costs, if you will, across many, many customers who also need those chips. So when they were going through that process, Pat Gelsinger was there then. He had just gone back to Intel to be their CEO. And Pat was looking for a chief legal officer who really understood innovation, but also understood the manufacturing side from a legal perspective and a business perspective. And so I was recruited into that role. So that's how I got there.
And how many years were you at Intel?
So I was there for 4 years doing a really important part of Intel's transformation. We did a lot of work on, just the strategy, the strategic plan, turning around the culture and really thinking about the future for Intel and how Intel was going to get back to competitiveness. So that was a huge part of the work that I did there, is really helping to transform the culture, the leadership team, working very closely with the board and Pat Gelsinger, and then ultimately with Lip Bhutan.
So getting back to the law firms and expectations that in-house has of them, especially now tech, you talked about probably going to be two trajectories for law firms. Either you're with it and are trying to move forward, or you're not using it because you think you can handle it human only. But so we hear this all the time that pressure's not the right word, but there is an expectation that I'm gathering from in-house counsel on law firms that they use the tech that's out there. Nowadays, AI, but there's other tech out there. What does that mean? If in-house counsel expects their law firms to be really using tech to benefit the company as a client, what's that really mean? What is the expectation?
I think it's mixed, and I think it's evolving very, very rapidly, right? I mean, this space has changed so much. I would say really since ChatGPT launched about 2.5, 3 years ago now, generative AI and now agentic AI, just the evolution and the amount of change that we've seen in the last, weeks and months and years is really incredible. We've never seen this level of innovation before. And so I think, the lawyers who are leading their functions and leading their firms also need to be nimble and need to be continuing to evaluate it every day. I think what we're seeing is you had some in-house lawyers, CLOs, and others who initially were saying, "I don't want my law firms using it at all because I see what's going on when I hear this about this hallucination. People are filing briefs in courts that have, miscited quotes and, cases that never actually happened." So you had that extreme where some people were saying, "Don't use AI at all, or disclose to me exactly how you're using AI." Then you have other CLOs who are really leaning in. So can you imagine if you said to a law firm, "Don't use email or don't use the internet in providing services to me, or disclose to me how you're using the internet." And so that's kind of how I think of AI, is like it's ubiquitous. Everyone needs to be using it. Certainly, we want to understand how they're using it, and we want them to do it in a way that's responsible, that's effective and efficient. And we want to get the value and the benefit from leveraging those technologies. But I think as knowledge workers, the legal industry, that's what we do. I think AI is particularly well suited to help us in our work and to make us more efficient. And I think anyone who's not using it and doesn't understand that is going to be left behind. Certainly, you need guardrails and you need governance and you need to understand the AI and what you're using it for and have the right technology stack. But you can't have your head in the sand and say, "We're not going to use it." I also think law firms can't simply say, "I'm gonna get a subscription, to this particular platform, and I'm just gonna pass that cost on directly to my client with the same billable hour structure, the same, spending the same amount of time that I would have before," i.e., the clients are not getting any of the benefits of that efficiency. We know that model does not work, and I think some law firms have tried that and were trying that. I think they really understand now that that can't happen. I think the other thing we're seeing, Chad, and of course, this is top of mind for everyone, just in the last couple of weeks or months, especially, is the cost of AI. Now we're starting to really understand and see the cost of those tokens, which is not surprising, right? Companies are spending billions of dollars in research and development and infrastructure build out and energy costs. Yet they were charging, a subscription of $300 per person per year. That's not sustainable. These tokens are very, very expensive. So we need to make sure that the firms are using AI in the right ways as the right resource so that we are actually seeing that efficiency and getting the benefit of that efficiency.
To that point of efficiency, you want them to use it, but you also to be efficient, you need to know how to use it, right? And you mentioned this earlier, how law firms historically have tried to focus their lawyers into specialization, but that may not be suitable anymore because you need to have more broad experience. What do you look for if you're interviewing somebody right now, a young lawyer, for a role either in-house or at a law firm? Like, what attributes are you looking for in that person?
Number one, I want somebody who's intellectually curious and who is open to always be learning, that they're going to not think that they have ever fully arrived and they don't need to learn anything else. So I want people who are intellectually curious, who want to learn from the technology, who want to learn from the other lawyers and professionals that they're practicing with. I think that is critically important, and be open to these different technology platforms. Be willing to fail, right? And fail fast, because if you're too risk averse and you're not willing to fail, it probably means you're never going to lean in enough to some of the technology so that you can learn, what works and what doesn't work. So that humbleness and being willing to fail and not afraid of that, I think is critically important. Then of course, I want people that have really high EQs and work well with other people, that don't have sharp elbows, that are collaborative, et cetera, that are team players. And for my senior teammates, I want people who can be a player and a coach. They're not just a coach. They're not just kind of directing people what to do, but they actually are leaning in and helping to drive the work as well.
So you said something interesting there. They can't be afraid to fail. But then you come back to your point about the law firms, boiling the ocean to give you a memo. It seems to me like there's two ways of training the lawyers here, right? Like the law firm wants to, just for many reasons, to be thorough and just make sure you're giving the best advice. They want to look under every rock. But if you're in-house counsel, you just need a quick answer to make a business decision. Like, what do you mean when you say you want to hire somebody that's not afraid to fail? Because it can mean a couple different things.
So when I talk about failure, number one, we want people to make new mistakes, right? So we don't want people to make the mistakes that are really obvious that people have already made, but we don't want people to be afraid to fail such that they are afraid to try. That part is really important. We do learn a lot from failing and from those failures, and all of us together should be embracing that. So that's really important. In terms of not wanting lawyers and law firms to boil the ocean, what I mean by that, and this comes from having close relationships with your law firms, if they really understand your business and they really understand you and the clients that are asking the questions, they should either really understand the value proposition of a particular question we're asking them, or if they don't, our relationships with them should be deep enough such that they would say, help me understand the value of this or your priorities here. Are we looking for a quick answer? If they understand the business, they probably understand the risk involved in the particular question or project that you are asking them to engage in. And so they should know, some things really do deserve the A plus answer. And, you're going to look under every rock and, do research for hours and hours and hours, or, whatever it takes. Where some other questions are, the risk are lower and the value proposition is lower. So you do want to be able to get a quick answer, so that you can give some direction without causing the business to be stalled for weeks and weeks and weeks while you're waiting on an answer from legal. That just doesn't work. We expect our law firms to work with us very closely to really understand that and to know the business.
Do you think some part of that though is just, I guess, lack of communication, where maybe in-house counsel isn't telling them, look, don't turn over every rock for this, need a quick answer? Or is that being said and the law firms just aren't, they're just kind of sticking to their ways?
I think it's probably a mix of both. I mean, sometimes the law firm model is not necessarily aligned with the best interest of the client, because the law firm model is all about selling legal services and billing time. And of course, for many law firms, certainly not all of them, but the more time they bill, the more money they're going to make. And so we need to make sure that our incentives are aligned. And that's why I talk about the relationships that we have with law firms and, wanting to work really closely together so that we both see value from the relationship. They're not simply seeing us as, an opportunity to bill more hours. Those relationships are not sustainable. And I think hadn't been for a while, but I think there are still firms who, lean into those models and try to explain later why the bills are so high. I don't think that makes for lasting, trusting relationships with your law firms.
If you got a 3L coming to you for guidance, mentorship, or whatever, and they want to say, hey, April, I want to excel at a law firm. I want to rise to the highest ranks in a legal department. and you say to them, well, you need certain skills nowadays, you need to do this and that. Like, how can they get these skills? These skills you talked about, where emotional intelligence, the tech skills they need, the way to use AI. What do you tell this person?
Yeah, I think part of it is it takes time, right? This is why many people are concerned about the legal model and what it means with artificial intelligence. Being a lawyer, it's an apprentice model. And so it takes time, right? That's why people call it practicing. You have to spend time practicing, really digging into facts and circumstances and different types of projects to really understand the law and understand what your options are. And I would say put in the time. You're not going to be an excellent lawyer when you come out of law school. You're not going to be an excellent lawyer in year one or year two. You really have to spend a lot of time working closely with other lawyers and really understanding how to apply the law to different facts and circumstances. And I always think about Malcolm Gladwell and his 10,000 hours, which is about 8 years, right? It kind of takes 8 years to be an expert at something. And this is a concern around people using and relying on artificial intelligence too much. People are saying, well, how are young lawyers going to learn? You can't cram all of that kind of 10,000 hours into 1 hour just because you have the AI tool, if the AI is giving you the answer. So again, first, put in the work and really learn as much as you can and work closely with other senior lawyers and business professionals to lean into your particular area that you really want to become an expert in and learn more about. Build relationships. A big part of what we do as lawyers is we deliver trusted advice and we cause people to act by persuasion. And people are not going to be persuaded by you if you don't have a relationship with them and if they don't trust you. And so a lot of what we do is work on building those trusted relationships with our clients, whether they're our in-house clients or if you're at a law firm, your clients who are engaging you on their particular projects. I think those two are probably the most important things is do the work to really know the law because ultimately what we're providing is judgment and expertise. And you can't be either if you haven't put in the time and done the work. And then nobody's going to listen to your expertise and your advice. Again, if they don't trust you and believe you, you have to spend time on the relationship piece too. Developing an innovative culture is hugely important for businesses to be successful, but that includes lawyers as well. And I don't think lawyers necessarily have a reputation for always being innovative and leaning in to technology. And I think, in some ways, the technology for the legal industry has let us down in the past. It's a smaller industry. We've seen lots of technology companies kind of come and go and fail. This is different though. Artificial intelligence is different. And so I think to be successful, lawyers need to really be leaning into that innovation and leaning into artificial intelligence and really understanding how it's going to help them deliver their services in a way that is, more efficient and more effective because our industry is being disrupted. It is absolutely being disrupted. It will not be the same in 10 years. You're seeing lots of private equity and other investors coming in and wanting to invest in knowledge industries like legal because they see that opportunity and we cannot be blind to that. So I just would encourage people to lean into that innovation.
I agree 100%. AI is different. It's like a tool. It's like, accessing back in the day Westlaw or LexisNexis. We could get to the case law quicker, although this is leaps and bounds ahead of that. But you said something there very interesting. I've never really, maybe people thought it. I've got my opinions on it. But you said legal tech has been smaller and let us down before. What did you mean by that specifically? What about legal tech has not been up to snuff in your opinion?
Well, I think software development historically has been very expensive. And because the legal technology industry is small compared to other industries, we didn't have the same level of investment in technology. So they tended to be very small companies, very early stage. They had a great idea or a great product, but they weren't able to scale it because they didn't have the resources to scale it. They got acquired by somebody else, and that somebody else said, "You know what? I like this technology, but let's focus over here. Much bigger TAM, much bigger opportunity." And therefore, the legal tech kind of faded away and was not the priority. And so I think, we've seen these small technology companies that were acquired, went bankrupt, didn't have enough resources to ultimately scale to really serve really large institutions. I think that's fundamentally different. I mean, look how Anthropic is really, for example, leaning into their legal plugins for Claude. I think it's pretty incredible. And we're seeing lots and lots of investments in the legal tech stack.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder, you mentioned PE too, because now, to your point, it was expensive. The market for legal tech was smaller. Now that there's kind of loosening of the rules, who can own law firms, who can own legal service providers, I think that contributes to it too. Don't you agree?
I agree. And I saw something also recently that, like, I think PwC and Accenture and NVIDIA and Anthropic and Google and a number of other companies in the tech ecosystem are deploying like thousands and thousands of engineers into companies to go out and research and better understand our business processes so that they can then take those business processes and basically address them with artificial intelligence. So I think part of what we're seeing too is more and more non-lawyers are going to be doing work that
Right.
historically was done by lawyers because now the machines can understand it more. There's going to be a lawyer in the loop, if you will, the human in the loop. But I think more of that work is going to be done by knowledge workers who are not necessarily lawyers, and they're going to be assisted by these huge technology stacks, which is, again, I think why we see more and more non-lawyers, private equity, et cetera, wanting to invest in the legal industry. They just see that opportunity for disruption.
Interesting times. I'll talk to you here in a few years to see how it's different.
Interesting times, Chad. Thanks for all the work you're doing in this space too. I think it's fantastic, and I love listening to the conversations that you're having. So keep it up.
Thank you. Okay, that's a wrap for today's episode. As always, we really appreciate you listening. If you want to subscribe, you can find us on most major podcast platforms like Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, etc. Also, if you like us enough, I hope you leave us a favorable review. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, this has been Technically Legal.